Footage of the first World Cup final in 1930 is scarce. The clips on YouTube are grainy, brief and hard to follow, so it's impossible to tell what part José Leandro Andrade played in Uruguay's 4-2 victory over Argentina. According to accounts from those who were there, his form, speed and influence had started to wane, yet his name still appears in the FIFA team of the tournament. That final would be his last appearance for Uruguay, the best team in the world in the 1920s. There is a little more footage of him in the Olympic Games of 1924 and 1928 in Paris and Amsterdam, both won by Uruguay. As Andrade stylishly controls a pass and tricks his way past a Swiss defender in the Paris final, he is described by the commentator as the Black Pearl, the first global star of international football. Uruguay were the first South American team to play in Europe, and Andrade was the first black international player seen by Europeans, who were so impressed that 250,000 people applied for tickets to the 1928 Olympic final. Andrade played in the final of all three of Uruguay's great triumphs from 1924 to 1930, but he was much more than just an exotic footballer. He was born in Salto, in the north of Uruguay, also the home of Luis Suarez and Edison Cavani, in 1901. His mother was Argentinian, but there was no record of his father, and so he was registered illegitimate. He would move to Montevideo to live with an aunt, growing up in the Palermo district of the city. Money was scarce, but the black population was integrated, so Andrade would have played football with boys from all social classes in the parks, and by the time he was a teenager would have been welcome at the city's clubs, which, unlike those in other parts of South America, welcomed players of all races. Two questions, both subjective, constantly arise when considering his life. The first, how good a player was he? And the second, how popular or unpopular, famous or infamous might he have been if television and social media had existed when he was supposedly the central figure in the world's best football team? Given that the Olympic football tournament was the nearest thing to a World Cup before Uruguay hosted the first one in 1930, Andrade's achievements put him at the pinnacle of the game. In the pre-television world, he was football's first international superstar. He was also its first black superstar, and its first rags-to-riches player whose life story would make a good film. He was the best-known player in Uruguay's era of dominance, but whether he was most influential is harder to say. Some have called him the first Pelé. Others see him more as the first David Beckham, a sporting sex symbol with a touch more style than substance. Andrade was an accomplished musician, an expert tango dancer, a womanizer, a drinker, a party lover. He dressed like a dandy. He was elegant, arrogant, aloof, and off the pitch ill-disciplined. He upset a lot of people, causing great offence on one occasion when he failed to attend a homecoming party arranged in his honour. When his playing career finished, he couldn't hold down a job. He began a descent into a syphilitic hell of poverty, alcoholism, blindness, and early death. He was 56 when he died in an asylum in Montevideo on the 4th of October 1957. The Stanford University academic Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, a respected multilingual philosopher and expert in the history of literature and culture, believes Andrade was responsible more than anybody else in the first third of the 20th century for putting football on the map of international sports. Gumbrecht tentatively describes Andrade as a 1920s version of Zinedine Zidane, though in looks and bearing the 6-foot halfback was perhaps more reminiscent of Frank Rijkaard. Gabriel Anot, the former international player who edited L'Équipe, said Uruguay's 1924 players were like thoroughbreds next to farm horses in comparison with North European players. Andrade played mostly at halfback, from where he dominated games, busy in both halves of the pitch. Gumbrecht wrote, in praise of athletic beauty in 2006, all eyewitnesses were enchanted with the effortless elegance in his movements. There was a sensational athletic energy about Andrade's performances which awakened strong waves of an almost erotic desire. One of Latin America's great writers, the Uruguayan Eduardo Galeano, delved into sport when he wrote Football in Sun and Shadow in the 1990s, the decade when France Football magazine named Andrade as one of the top most influential players in World Cup history. In Galeano's words, Europe had never seen a black man play football. In the 1924 Olympics, Andrade dazzled everyone. This rubber-bodied giant would sweep the ball downfield without ever touching an adversary. He dazzled them off the pitch too. Andrade enjoyed the Paris nightlife, at times during the tournament and with vigour afterwards. He met Colette, the great writer, who wondered at his athleticism. He danced a tango with Josephine Baker, the popular US entertainer, who, like her partner, was known as the Black Pearl. Whether the tango finished in the bedroom is, like so much about Andrade, unclear. On one occasion, his close friend and teammate Angel Romano went to find him in the city. At an address Andrade had given, a swanky apartment, Romano found him surrounded by a group of semi-naked women. There were reports that Andrade was later abducted by a wealthy French woman who kept him in luxury for weeks. He returned to Uruguay many weeks later, a changed man, disembarking from the boat home in yellow gloves, an expensive coat, leather boots, a silk cravat, and a top hat. That was impressive, given that not so much earlier he'd been a street corner newspaper vendor, shoe-shine boy, and some said, gigolo. Less impressive was his refusal to attend a party organised for him by Montevideo's black community. He never explained why. Teammates were not surprised, describing Andrade as aloof and uncommunicative. During the Paris Games, Uruguay, with Andrade performing what might nowadays be called a roaming creative midfield role, were such an attraction that their players were invited back to Europe a year later. Nacional, for whom he played between 1925 and 1930, made a 9-country tour of the continent. More than 800,000 people watched them, and by the time of the 1928 Olympic Games, Uruguay were the must-see team, and the previously amateur players would no doubt have been on very good expenses. It was at these games that FIFA decided to move away from amateurism and start a World Cup. Andrade played only half of Nacional's 1925 tour. He visited a doctor in Brussels and, said a teammate, was told he had syphilis. For a while he disappeared to Paris, returning to Montevideo 2 months later. On arrival, he told a reporter he was feeling somewhat ill and would undergo a course of treatment. He played on, having lost a little pace but none of his skill. He declined to travel to Amsterdam as Uruguay sought to defend their Olympic title, but when he waved the team farewell at the dockside, he changed his mind. He took the next boat to Rio de Janeiro and joined the team. Uruguay won again, defeating their perennial rivals and 1930 World Cup final victims Argentina in a replayed final. In an earlier match, Andrade ran into a goalpost, and some said the injury was so serious that he was later blinded in one eye. The more likely explanation is that his blindness, like other health problems, was caused by syphilis. Dutch journalists were as impressed by Andrade as the French had been 4 years earlier. Andrade was such a great player, and his colleagues were such aces that you felt sorry to leave the stadium, one of them wrote. Richard Hoffmann, a Germany international who played in Amsterdam, said of Andrade, he was a football artist who could simply do anything with the ball. He was always ahead with his thoughts by several moves. Andrade held his form long enough for that first World Cup 2 years later, starting all the hosts' games. After playing on for a couple of seasons at lesser clubs, he slipped into financial trouble in the 1930s, but as he'd never endeared himself to the public, attempts to raise money from a testimonial match failed. In 1950, when the World Cup returned to South America, Andrade was invited to Brazil as a guest of honour. His nephew, Victor Rodrigues Andrade, who added the second family name in honour of his illustrious uncle, became the second Andrade to earn a World Cup winner's medal. The younger Andrade was also Uruguay's best player in the 1954 World Cup, at which they lost an extra-time semi-final against Hungary. Aldo Mazzucchelli, a Uruguayan professor of Hispanic culture at Brown University in Rhode Island, believes racial integration in Uruguay was a significant factor in Andrade's rise to fame. Mazzucchelli has spent more time than most looking into the story of Andrade. He invented a particular manoeuvre called the La Tijera, the scissors, going to ground with the left leg fully extended forwards and kicking the ball with his right foot, said Mazzucchelli. It was apparently spectacular and elegant and is mentioned obsessively when it comes to him. He had very good control with both legs, even though he was right-footed, and was great at heading too. He never celebrated a goal. Even though he was precise and efficient, he seemed as though he couldn't care less about anything. And the German journalist and author Fritz Hack, who featured Andrade in his 1972 book Kings of Football, went looking for this giant of global football's early years. For 6 days he trailed around Montevideo before finally he found the footballer with golden feet. Friends helped me, Hack wrote, but what I found was horrible. Andrade was living in a dilapidated basement flat, with barely any furniture. He was alcoholic, blind in one eye, and unable to understand Hack's questions. That was in the autumn of 1956, and just over a year later, he was dead. His last days spent as a penniless drunk in an asylum. Hack's account of that last meeting between the player and the journalist records that Andrade's only possession appeared to be a shoebox full of medals.
This video was adapted from a story that originally appeared in The Blizzard. The Blizzard is a quarterly football magazine edited by Jonathan Wilson. It's football journalism for people who think about the game more than everyone else. You can click the link below to subscribe or find out more, and handily, The Blizzard is also beautifully designed and they make wonderful gifts for friends and family. So visit theblizzard.co.uk for more information, and thank you for watching.